Hello ladies. Okay, so I had a question about sourdough. I'm gonna just kind of make a video that way if you have a question about it, this can kind of help answer everyone's questions. And it's going to be assuming that you already have an active sourdough starter. So I did not have to make my sourdough starter. It's basically just fermented water and flour. And I got it from attending like a little class slash seminar on sourdough, and then you got to leave with your own sourdough starter, which was like so cool. But so this is assuming you already have your sourdough starter, and I'm gonna be honest, I've never had to make the sourdough starter from scratch, and I think that's one of the most tedious parts of starting sourdough. So just like a little background, sourdough is a great bread of choice because it has a fermented part of the process in making it, and that is the sourdough starter. So this, like I was just saying before, the sourdough starter is fermented bread and water, and that's the piece that makes the bread a little bit easier to digest, which makes it a good option for consuming bread. And so that is a good option, or just, I suppose just like good to know. So, you know, assuming you have your starter, this is kind of where you can kind of pick up. So I have a couple recipes that I've followed. The first one is a baguette recipe, and then which is like a thinner bread that you can break into larger sections and enjoy with any sort of like pasta or soup. And then I've done a bread loaf. So I suppose, I guess like two things to know when it comes to making your bread to kind of prepare. There's kind of, it's a little bit of a process, and I'm going to speak from the loaf perspective because, and this is just the recipe that I followed, which I'm pretty sure a lot of them are similar. And from what I've learned and gathered about making your own bread, as there are hour recommendations for it to sit maybe on the counter or in the refrigerator, sourdough itself is pretty lenient with, you know, if it ends up sitting 2 hours longer than the recommended time, it ends up being okay. So, although there was one time I made the bread and it was supposed to sit like in the fridge for 12 hours, and I let it sit in there for like 2 days. and when I went to bake the bread, hi sweetie. When I went to bake the bread, it was very dense. Like the dough was very dense, and I don't think it cooked all the way through. So maybe, you know, it's not as reliable as I might think. However, there's a big difference between 12 hours and like 48. I'll speak on the loaf. So really bread is just a couple of ingredients. It's flour, water, butter, honey is in my recipe, and salt, and the sourdough starter, which I suppose when you're like thinking about making your bread from a scheduling standpoint, it ends up being about like a 3 to 2 day process, including your fermented sourdough starter. And I'll include a couple videos in here. But so you have your starter. I guess I'll just start with the starter. So you have your starter, let's say it's not active. And when I say active, I mean it's like bubbly, like it's kind of alive. It means it's peak ferment. It's like in a peak fermentation process. So you'll keep your starter in the fridge. And when you're ready to make your bread, you'll take it out and you will measure how much starter you have. And it's just literally it's just like doughy, like Play-Doh-y, watery Play-Doh-y. It's a water mixture. And you're gonna measure how much you have, and you can use a kitchen scale for that. So let's say you have 60 grams of sourdough starter. You're going to mix in 60 grams of flour and 60 grams of water. You're going to stir it. You're going to pop the lid back on your glass mason jar or whatever jar that you're storing your starter in. And you're going to put it in a warm room. My kitchen's really cold, so I would use our bedroom because it's actually one of the warmer rooms in the house. And you would let it sit there for about 6 hours. And what it will do is it will double in size. So let's say this is how much starter you have. After you mix in your flour and water, it's going to ferment and it will double in size in the next 6 hours. So 6 hours go by, you notice it's doubled in size, and what it's going to be, it's going to look really bubbly, almost like elasticy, I feel like is a good word to describe it. It'll look like you can kind of pull it apart. It'll look kind of stretchy. It'll look like it has bubbles in it, like air bubbles, and that means it's ready to bake with. And that's going to be an ingredient in your bread recipe. So once it's quote unquote alive and bubbly, after that 6 hour mark, what you're gonna do is you're gonna bring it to the kitchen and you're gonna start the bread making process. And it doesn't it sounds intimidating, but just by following the recipe and doing it a couple of times, you're gonna get the hang of it. So you bring your starter into your kitchen and you'll follow the recipe. It's like 4 cups of flour mixed with maybe like 2 cups of water, a cup of your starter, so that, you know, that bubbly stuff, you're going to use a cup of it in your recipe until it's basically like a big ball that's, what is the word they use? Flaky, I feel like. After you mix it, it's not going to be like, you know how cookie dough raw is kind of dry? Your dough will kind of feel the same way. So mix it up. What you're going to do is let it sit in the bowl and it's going to rise. So then there's this rising part of the process. Oh, Mr. Liam. The bread's going to rise, and I just leave it in the bowl and I put like a towel over it and I let it sit on the counter, or I let it sit on the counter. It'll rise for like 2 hours. And this is kind of the point where you're just following the instructions. However, depending on the recipe, it might have you allow the bread to rise once or twice. You know, I would read through the recipe before you make the bread. That way you can budget in your head how much time you're gonna need. But yeah, and then you're going to bake it, and it's gonna smell delicious. And I found that using parchment paper in your in your baking dishes makes it really easy to take the bread out and then keep your pan clean. So that's a little tip that I have. And then one tip I took away from the seminar that I can see why is really helpful now is that when you're baking your bread in the oven, you can put it on like the second rack, and then on the rack just below it, you can put a baking dish. And that's just going to help the bottom of the bread not bake quicker than the rest of the bread. But those are a couple, I think, good starter notes / tips if you're interested in making your own bread. There's a lot of different recipes, and you can even do things like biscuits and pancakes. And really, it's just a matter of baking the good with the starter, which is that fermented part of the process. So I hope that was valuable. I actually think that's all I wanted to include. If I can think of anything else, I will create another video.